Has anyone else noticed how many Lorwyn card names sound like Shakespearean insults? Like, thou art but a scuzzback scrounger. I bite my thumb at thee, hexing squelcher. He is a surly farrier, prevaricating around in the manner of a gangly stompling. Anyway, hey, welcome back to the channel. So I have a question for you. How often have you been super excited to get some new cards from a new set? You bought them, you waited eagerly for those cards to arrive, you put them into a deck, and then when you finally saw them in action, maybe a couple days or weeks later, you realize that you know what? These cards actually maybe aren't as good as I thought they were, and maybe you take one or two or even all of them out of that deck. Like, remember all of the buzz about Final Word Phantasm? Or when Bootlegger Stash was $30? Yeah, that was a trick question I asked before. I already know that your answer is that you've done this more than once. We have all done this more than once. We have all gotten a card that looked good when you read it, but it didn't necessarily live up to the hype once you played it. And that makes us all kind of wonder, how can we stop ourselves from falling for that again? In fact, is there any data about this that we can use to try and figure that process out? Do we have any insight to which sets of cards do have the staying power to last beyond just the hype cycle? And if so, what cards are they and why? Well, you gravel-gill scoundrels, I have got some data to share with you. And no joke, this might be one of the coolest graphs that we've ever gotten to show you on this channel. What we're seeing here is a graph of the average number of original cards from each set that made their way into decks every week for the past 2 years. So for example, if decks on average contained 1 card from Duskmourn or 2 cards from Tarkir Dragonstorm, from Murders at Carl's Jr. Manor to Lorwyn Eclipsed, we see every single set jump up upon its initial release, immediately getting a high rate of how many cards from that set are making their ways into decks across the format, but then, over the following months, they settle down as people find out which of those cards are working the best for them after all. Some sets definitely achieve higher spikes than others, although some also fall a lot farther than others. As I also mentioned last week, this type of video is also going out into a podcast feed because it's just really cool information that we want to get out to a whole bunch of folks, and it will be, of course, describing these visuals to the folks who are only accustomed to listening through an audio medium. But for those folks, I definitely recommend checking out the video versions of these on YouTube so that you can see all these cool visuals because the graphs are really dang awesome. And of course, I recommend liking, subscribing, maybe even visiting Patreon if you want even more cool behind-the-scenes data as well. But hey, let's dive in now. Let's start with the biggest spikes, the sets that achieved the highest penetration into decks. Not a good enough reason to use the word penetration there. The sets that saw the highest average number of cards make it into the 99 when the sets released were Avatar: The Last Airbender and Final Fantasy. Both of them peaked at over 3 cards from those sets making it into deck lists every week. And remember, those are original cards that we're talking about, not reprints. I'll get to that in a different video. Both of those sets benefited from broad appeal in their mechanical implementation. Cool equipment in Final Fantasy, for instance, or the crystals generating a whole lot of interest for a lot of monocolor decks. And Avatar also had some cards that were basically multi-classing. Earthbending cards, for instance, ring the bells for multiple pre-existing archetypes. Also, that Bender's Waterskin card, that thing is the truth, y'all. Colored mana that untaps every single turn is so useful. Do not sleep on that one. It's really good. Now, for the record, the number I just said there, 3 cards, that might sound a little bit small, but to be honest, if you're adopting 3 entire cards into your deck from just a single set, that's actually kind of big, especially when you consider that the cards that usually make it into decks are often taking up spell slots rather than land slots, just, for the average set. Like, yeah, new sets sometimes have a new land cycle that can be of interest to players, but that's not always a given. Most of the cool new cards that people are running from sets tend to be in the form of spells and creatures and other stuff like that. So in that case, if you're taking 3 original cards from a brand new set into your deck, it's often more like those 3 cards are taking up 3 of 60-ish spots instead of taking up 3 of 100 total spots. Just some food for thought there about the reality of the scope of these numbers that we're talking about. Unless, of course, you're one of those folks who gets a new spell from a set and then takes out a land to put that spell into a deck, in which case, stop it. Bad. The next highest spikes that we see on this graph are all bunched around an average of 2 cards each per set, making it into deck lists. They are, in order of highest to lowest, Modern Horizons 3 and Bloomburrow, both just slightly above the 2-card threshold, and then Duskmourn and Tarkir Dragonstorm, whose spikes are just slightly beneath that line. I think a few of those sets did end up having slightly more inward synergies. Bloomburrow focuses on very specific creature types in most of its cards, which not everyone will always flock towards, or room cards in Duskmourn, for example. Those are generally good cards, but they also need to be built around a little bit more specifically if you're trying to harness them beyond just a coolness factor. Meanwhile, Modern Horizons 3 had the modal double-faced lands like Sink into Stupor, which could make it into more places more often. But put a pin in that for now. More on those just a little bit later. And then continuing much lower down, there were a smattering of sets that peaked at an average of 1.5 cards per deck, Outlaws of Thunder Junction and Edge of Eternities for instance, but the lowest spikes that we see come from Assassin's Creed, Magic Foundations, and in the lowest spot, Ether Drift, which all spiked at a max of 1 card per set, making it into decks on average. And again, that's 1 card at their top peak. They fell farther down afterwards. In general, I think these sets kind of suffered from very insular mechanics, or parasitic designs as Wizards of the Coast calls it. Assassin's Creed was a set that mostly focused on historic and assassin synergies. If you weren't playing those archetypes, it was kind of hard to justify running any of those cards. Assassin's Creed was also a smaller release set, so we should take that into account here as well. If anything, I'm actually really surprised that Foundations was one of the lowest spikes that we see on this graph. It's wild that it's at such a low spot. I think that set had banger cards. I mean, Banner of Kinship, High Fae Trickster, those designs are really good. But it's possible that since this was a core set, that affected things a little bit here, and really I think it ends up being a matter of price. The top 7 cards from that set are all above $10 each, so it's possible that Foundations ultimately got throttled by accessibility and availability. And again, remember, right now we're just talking about the spikes, as in these sets peaked at that much, but then eventually went down in the months that followed, as players maybe were testing out some of those cards, but eventually took some of those cards out of the decks that they were playing. But before we can evaluate why these sets spiked and then fell, and how much they have respectively fallen, please allow me a quick word from our sponsors. First, Dragon Shield. Dragon Shield has sleeves with officially licensed Magic art from Fetch Lands to the Dragon, and has an upcoming line of guild sleeves we're very excited about. Plus, they have custom sleeves. In fact, if you want to get custom EDH Rec sleeves, very Dark Side of the Moon vibes, you can check out the link in the description. And if you order from their store, use code EDHREC for a discount. Again, that's code EDHREC, all lowercase, for a discount on Dragon Shield's superb sleeves. And another fun announcement, we've officially released the Space Cow Media merch store at shop.spacecowmedia.com. We've teamed up with Archidect, Cardsphere, a bunch of awesome deck building websites so that you can get cool stuff from cool places. EDH Rec mugs, Archidect hats, channel tees and hoodies, Cardsphere playmats, just good quality stuff. Playmats I use on the regular, shirts that I wear because they're just dang comfortable. Go check it out at shop.spacecowmedia.com. Okay, back to the data. So far, I've mentioned how high these spikes got, but that doesn't matter quite as much as how far those sets fell after those surges. So which sets fell the hardest and which sets had the most staying power? Let's take a peek and see what's causing what. As impressive as Avatar's spike was, it's already fallen pretty far back down. It jumped up to 3 cards per deck at its peak, but it has fallen to 1.5. And in a lot of ways, that is very similar to the trajectory of most of these other sets. Tarkir and Duskmourn also jumped up, for instance, but over time they too were cut in half, from a spike of 2 cards to an average of 1 nowadays. Bloomburrow is pretty similar. It jumped to just above 2 cards at first, but it's now barely holding at 1 original card in the average deck as well. This gets even more dire for the sets that didn't have as big of a spike in the first place. Fallout barely got to 1.25, and it's now currently at an average of 0.5. Certainly keep in mind though that since that set was only precons, that is of course going to influence its availability relative to all of these other sets that got a full-on proper set release. Also, to make sure that I acknowledge it, Lorwyn Eclipsed and Turtles data is a little bit too new and too fresh for us to pull any meaningful results from those sets just yet. Overall, the ratio of drops for most of these sets tends to be pretty darn similar. However, the sets that had the best retention have wound up being Final Fantasy, Edge of Eternities to a smaller extent, and also Modern Horizons 3. Final Fantasy had a pretty high spike, but it's also still holding strong at just a little bit under the 2-card average, making their way into decks out there. Edge of Eternities didn't spike very high, but it also hasn't fallen necessarily very far, which I think means that people are finally catching on to how good some of those cards in that set actually are. And we see a similar and frankly even more impressive thing with Modern Horizons 3. That set didn't peak quite as high as some of the others, but it also barely fell at all. It spiked up to just above 2 cards per deck on average, and it has now settled at just a little under 2 cards per deck on average. So what did these sets have that helped out with card retention? To answer that, I've got another graph for you. This here is a breakdown of the kinds of cards that make up what's actually showing up in decks out there. The purple bars signify any card that is eligible to be a commander. Not just the commander of a deck, but any card that is technically eligible to find its way into the command zone, but that has overall made its way into the total 100 cards of a deck. The blue parts of the graph represent any regular non-commander card, and the green sections represent a non-basic land with a basic land type. In fact, let's just quickly address that one, because that's basically only a relevant factor for the surveil lands from Murders at Karl Marx Manor. Cards like Undercity Sewers and those other surveil lands with basic land types are one of the biggest contributors to why any cards from that set are showing up in decks kind of at all. In fact, here's that data another way. These are the types of those cards as they showed up in a set versus how often they show up in decks. While every other set has basically an equal ratio, like if a set had 20% legends and 80% non-commander cards, then the cards that actually make their way into decks are indeed 20% legendaries and 80% non-commander cards. That is not the case here at Murders at Car Alarm Fire Manor. Despite only taking up 10 card slots in that set, the surveil lands make up like 30% of the proportion of cards that see any play from there. Much like Fallout with its rad counters and Assassin's Creed with its assassins, Murders at Carly Rae Jepsen Manor had mechanics like face-down creatures and detectives and cases, all those things that again have more of an insular appeal. So were it not for those surveil lands, that set would have a very low score indeed. The rest of the cards from that set just did not make their way into that many decks at all. But okay, that out of the way, let's get back to the purple sections of this graph. Those represent any cards that could have been a commander, making it into the 100 cards of a commander deck, whether that's Ragost leading a deck or Halia being a role player in the 99. So yes, the graph that we saw earlier does include the commander, not just the scope of the 99 cards in the deck, in case you were wondering. And we can see for sets like Final Fantasy and for Avatar, the high density of legends in those sets contributes a lot on their parts of the graphs. Even just going off of the numbers on each of their respective EDHREC set pages, I think we can assume that a lot of the deck building energy in each of these sections is devoted to the amount that commanders specifically are a driving force for those sets. Or really, that's the case for any set with a high density of legends. After all, we just saw that Final Fantasy is about 40% legends, so of course those will contribute a lot. But even then, it's not just that. A lot of those legends are playing important support roles, things that I've called a level 2 commander in a previous video. They're still really important role players that are pretty darn powerful for those strategies. I think overall, there's just a greater chance that players will end up paying attention to those cards when they are given the legendary moniker. But to be honest, the coolest part of this chart to focus on is the blue, the non-commander cards that are definitely in the 99 and not in the command zone at all. And when we focus on those, Modern Horizons 3 sweeps up the competition. And this is primarily due to the most popular cards in that set. Those modal double-faced land cards are much easier to slot into decks than any other type of card, which gave that set a huge leg up in terms of its broad appeal, despite the fact that very few of its legends wound up being as big of a draw compared to other sets. Don't get me wrong, it had some. I mean, Necrobloom and Ulalek are still sporting over 22,000 decks each, but there were some other contemporaries this year that went way past that figure. And that brings me back to the Modern Horizons 3 section of that graph from earlier. It's the champion here in terms of sets that didn't fall nearly as hard as all of the others. When players got cards from that set, which admittedly this was a premium price set, so even getting that set in the first place required some extra dedication, but when people did get those cards, they just didn't waver as much. They didn't later go back and reconsider those things that they added nearly as often as we see for literally every single other set here. Alright, I debated about whether or not I would end up including this in the video because it is a bit of a sidebar, but if you will bear with me, when we look at the graph and see that there were very low amounts for Assassin's Creed and for Fallout, that makes sense because those were like a pre-con only set or a very small set. But Spider-Man is also having very similar numbers to that despite it being a major set release. And I feel I must acknowledge the low counts that we're seeing like that because of this. We have heard from designers like Mark Rosewater that the Spider-Man set was a best-selling set last year, but that is not what we're seeing in this data. In our graph here, we're seeing a low count for a set like Spider-Man, and that's also easy to see on its EDHREC page too. The commanders and cards there are not as popular as the other sets from that year. So, okay, what's going on, right? How do we square this discrepancy of reportings? Well, it begs the question, right? Like, is that a low play rate that we see in this data because the Spider-Man set didn't perform well, or is it because the populations of players who do go for a set like that simply are not reflected in this data? After all, we at EDHREC are drawing data from deck building websites, but tons of players do not upload their lists online. So while we do have a cool window into the player base with numbers like this, we always have to acknowledge our blind spots. And real quick, sometimes people think that I don't know that there's a blind spot there, and that's always very funny to me. So yes, let me just state the obvious out loud here. Based on some anecdotal experiences as well, I've heard from game store owners and people who regularly attend set releases at their LGSs that sets like Spider-Man and Turtles were very sparsely attended at those release events, and that those types of things often also stay on the shelves a lot longer than other types of sets do. But also, I do believe Mark Rosewater here when he reports this. Like, I have no reason to believe that he would be lying about this. But then again, I also do kind of wonder, like, is Wizards tracking just sales to distributors, not sales to players? So just because Wizards sold a lot of that set to stores doesn't necessarily mean that the stores moved a lot of that product. The truth is going to be somewhere in the middle of all of that. I just knew that that particular point would probably end up being a pretty big discussion point from this video, and I wanted to make sure that it was acknowledged in some way. And basically, I just wanted to provide you all the figures that we are seeing here, reflected in deck building activity online, because I hope that that will help you figure out what might be going on and how you all feel about it. On EDHREC, our numbers for a set like that is significantly lower than they are for other sets that have come out during this time window. And again, for the record, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle set is too new for us to have any meaningful data just yet, but I can't help but wonder how it will measure up compared to these prior and similar examples. Apologies for the sidebar, I just knew that would be a sticking point. So anyway, let's get back to the main thing. All of that brings us back to the question I posed at the start of the video. How can we stop ourselves from falling for hype of new cards and new sets? Well, in terms of final lessons, I think it's important to acknowledge how extremely normal it is to get excited about new cards, but for them to not always last. You know, maybe you bought 2 copies of a card because you thought that you would play it in 2 different decks, but now you've only ended up playing it in 1. That's very normal. Don't beat yourself up about it too much. In fact, not all of these drops down that we're seeing in the data reflect disappointed players. What it really represents is people who took a chance on something. You know, people who took out a staple from a deck to try giving a new thing a shot. I think that's very admirable behavior. And maybe those experiments didn't always last, but there's a lot of value in doing the experiment in the first place. But also, I hope that maybe some of this data might encourage folks to pay a little more attention to what specifically is driving the hype during new preview seasons. A bootlegger stash or a really expensive Everybody Lives. We've seen those stories before, and they can be a little bit disappointing if you bought into it at, I guess, the wrong moment. But maybe this could be the kind of thing that helps us to remember that when a whole bunch of folks are looking in one direction, taking a glance in another direction might help us to learn something new that a couple of other folks are missing. And keep in mind also that sometimes the cards that have the most staying power are probably the less eye-catching cards. My favorite new cards from Lorwyn Eclipsed aren't mythics and rares. It's Midnight Tilling, a common, and Personify, an uncommon. See again the uncommon MDFC lands from Modern Horizons 3. In some ways, those cards are almost boring because they can just go anywhere, and compared to cards like Necrobloom and Nadu that were coming out at that time, they weren't driving necessarily quite as much of the conversation around that set's release. It's not a good or a bad thing, it just is a thing, and sometimes keeping that in mind might end up helping you save a couple of bucks when you're looking at new cards. But again, if you're experimenting and giving new cards a chance, I think that's pretty neat too. I'd love to end this video with a quick patron shout out. Vladislav Musel, thank you so much for your generous support over on patreon.com/EDHRECcast. You make this possible, appreciate you to the moon and back. And we'll also end with a challenge the stats. From Caleb Chronomus, he recommends the card Wingmantle Chaplain for anyone who's looking to build a Preston the Vanisher deck. This card's in 16 out of the 3,000 Preston decks out there, and Preston's a pretty pricey card, but who's gonna be mad about a proxy Preston, right? And it's a neat strategy since Preston makes mini copies of your creatures. Wingmantle Chaplain is a 4-mana white creature that, when it comes into play, makes you bird tokens for each creature that you control with Defender, and it makes more bird tokens when you get more creatures with Defender entering play. On its own, it's not necessarily impressive as a blink target for just any old blink deck, but for Preston specifically, who says whenever a non-token creature enters your battlefield, you make a 0/1 illusion copy token of that creature, well, then it gets interesting, because now you can have the Chaplain enter, then stack the triggers for Preston's copy to resolve first, so that your original Chaplain now sees that you have 2 defenders when its original ability resolves, but also it just saw another defender creature enter, so then it will give you 3 total birds, and then also the new copy will give you 2 birds because you have 2 defenders, so all of that just on its own, you're getting 5 bird tokens and 2 defenders, plus a ton more when you blink the original Chaplain or populate the Chaplain token later. That sounds like a really cool tech to me. Thank you so much for this challenge, Caleb. Thank you, Vladislav, for being a patron, thanks to Dragon Shield for sponsoring the channel, and thank you for watching. Now hit the YouTube buttons, you sinister gnarlbark, because we've always got more data to show you. And until next time, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.